You've heard about the Russian propaganda campaign.
The Kremlin is waging an international disinformation campaign through the RT propaganda network
to make America look like the bad guy.
But you probably haven't heard of the socialist propaganda from the government-run network Telesur. Telesur wants you to know that capitalism always fails.
United States, Canada, Mexico, Panama, Haiti, Jamaica, Peru.
It's ridiculous propaganda, but Telesur videos get millions of views. People believe this?
That's one of the tragedies of this outlet.
Fergus Hodgson reports on Latin America. He's horrified by Telesur's success.
It has been influential in a terrible way.
Few viewers know that Telesur is funded by governments like Cuba and Venezuela, a country so bankrupted by socialism that people starve to death.
Parents are leaving their children at orphanages because they don't have enough food to feed them.
Despite that,
the Venezuelan government has refused aid from international organizations.
Instead, Venezuela spends money on videos like this one, saying philanthropy is a scam that allows the super rich to influence global affairs and treat capitalism as if it were the solution, not the cause of the world's problems. The man they picture is Warren Buffett's son, Howard, who is giving money to the UN hunger program, I assume doing good things.
They play on this idea of the fat capitalist pig, right?
Other videos are basic Marxist propaganda about how capitalists exploit workers because workers produce the wealth but take home just a small fraction of their labor and wages.
These words are just basically provoking jealousy or playing on jealousy.
Well, some capitalists make huge profit.
So what? That's great. I want to make a lot of profit too. So should everyone.
But capitalism is a system that relies on the exploitation of people and natural resources to generate profit.
Venezuela pays for these videos bashing capitalism, while real reporting, like this from the BBC, shows the country's store shelves are often empty.
This is what a supermarket looks like.
Just empty shelves, no food.
How could Telesur put a positive spin on that? They hired this American.
With so many claims of empty shelves, I went to several supermarkets around the city with a hidden camera.
Food shortages? Not true, says reporter Abby Martin.
So we just went to about 5 different supermarkets and the shelves were fully stocked. While it is true that there are shortages, it seems like you are very able to find things for everyday life, no problem.
She went into stores and found food.
Having food in a store is not exactly newsworthy. The fact that there's, that there's no food in many parts is the story.
Venezuela is starving. We are dying of hunger.
I wanted to interview Abby Martin for this video, but she didn't respond to my requests. Before she started doing propaganda for Telesur, she worked for Russia's propaganda network. There, she did at least criticize Russia for invading Ukraine, but she routinely praised socialist tyrants like Hugo Chavez.
It is undeniable that under his leadership, the poorest in the country were empowered.
Empowered by starving, shortages, rampant inflation?
As a reporter on this network, I face many ethical and moral challenges.
I wish Martin were as principled as reporter Liz Wall. She got so disgusted with RT that she quit on air.
I cannot be part of a network funded by the Russian government, and that is why, after this newscast, I'm resigning.
Now she does real news for Newsly.
It's an agreement signed by all sides.
But Abby Martin still does propaganda, now for Telesur, where her videos tell people Venezuelan police don't shoot protesters.
It seems like there certainly is a right to protest in Venezuela.
They're winning hearts and minds.
Yeah, even well-meaning people here in the United States, I will see them sharing Telesur material all the time.
That's capitalism in a nutshell.
They should know that this is a media outlet that is funded by dictatorial communists or tyrannical rulers.
It's a face of Cuban dignity and freedom.
If you share the material, you're sharing the lies of these brutal people. You're also sharing a media outlet that's funded by taking from the very poorest of the poor.
You are. Don't share it. Telesur is deceitful propaganda. And Abby Martin, my invitation stands. Come do an interview with us. Explain, why does an American do propaganda for socialist murderers?
School shooting in South Florida.
17 people shot to death.
What can be done about school shootings? Some say kids will be safer if some teachers carry guns. President Trump said that.
We need to let people know, you come into our schools, you're going to be dead.
Trump was mocked for suggesting teachers have guns.
Arm a teacher is completely insane.
It's a terrible idea.
A terrible idea.
But Trump's critics probably don't even know that many teachers have brought guns to school for years. In Texas, teachers carry in about 200 schools. This high school advertises that.
I can see that sign out on the highway. Boy, it's a great, man.
Parents we interviewed here like the policy.
It's a good idea.
I think we need it.
It makes me feel safer.
I love the King gun policy.
Superintendent Ricky Stevens created it, saying if there's trouble, teachers want to go defend the kids.
We know our staff and our teachers are going to go. Do we want them to go with a pencil or go with a pistol?
Everybody's against it.
This Florida student says teachers carrying guns is a terrible idea.
You're asking a teacher to fight an assault rifle with a handgun. That seems like a pretty unfair fight to me.
The teachers have handguns against somebody with a big gun. That's not much.
It's not much, but it's better than nothing. If you go there with nothing, you have no chance of stopping anything.
The police come. They see your teacher with a gun. How do you keep them from shooting her?
We train a lot with our local law enforcement. So that helps us because we want them to at least know we're there and at least recognize us. If they happen to get shot while they're stopping a tragedy, all of our guardians have said, you know, that's just the price of being a guardian.
His teachers saw how during the Florida school shooting, the security guard waited outside.
It made me mad.
It's a reason she's glad she can carry her gun at school.
You have to have a fighting chance if something should happen at our school.
We hid her identity because she and the school don't want a potential attacker to know which teachers are armed.
Are you carrying now?
Of course.
Many people say armed teachers create new dangers.
Teacher accidentally fired a gun in his classroom.
At this California school, a teacher mistakenly shot at the ceiling. One student was slightly hurt by falling debris. But that's the only incident we could find where a student was injured.
Took a rifle to his...
On the other hand, armed teachers have stopped school shootings.
16-year-old Luke Woodham has been arrested.
When this student killed two classmates, an assistant principal with a gun held the killer at gunpoint until police arrived. We don't know how often armed teachers deter shootings. The media can't cover crimes that never happened. The media also distort what President Trump proposed.
Donald Trump said teachers should have guns. Teachers should not be required to protect and serve and to teach.
Required? No teacher's required to carry. It's voluntary. Those who want to bring their guns to school can. Here's another distortion.
I really do not support the idea of arming teachers.
Arming teachers.
Arming teachers? A new federal program? That's not what the president proposed. Lots of teachers already have guns. All a school has to do is allow some to bring their guns to school. At the Keene School District, however, Superintendent Stevens did create a new government program.
The school purchases a gun, and then we give them and register them to our teachers.
That way, he says, he can make sure all teachers have training on the same type of gun. Finally, as we ponder the best way to keep students safe, we should address the scariest myth.
The epidemic shootings.
The epidemic of school shootings.
Despite what the media say, there is no epidemic of school shootings. No sharp increase. School shootings kill far fewer kids than driving, suicide, drowning, even suffocating. Why now? School shootings are not in a big uptick.
Exactly right. But we prepare for them because if even one shooting happens, it's more than we would want.
You're 10 times as likely to die suffocating.
Right.
I mean, you can't protect against all these things.
No, but we do train our kids in school how to not suffocate and how not to drown.
Certainly, Stevens' armed teacher program is cheaper than what my town does. New York City spends hundreds of millions of dollars stationing police officers in and around schools. Of course, here and in most blue states, suggesting that some teachers carry weapons horrifies people.
They don't understand that a responsible, trained teacher with a firearm is better than having a teacher with nothing. Texas will definitely probably be leading the way when it comes to protecting our kids with weapons, and that New York would choose to go a radically different way.
I'm glad that we live in a country where the local people can decide what goes on in their school district and not a bunch of people in New York City.
It's good that America has 50 states. That allows experiments. Teachers in New York City may fear guns, but teachers in Texas can serve and protect.
In a free market economy, it's a win-win situation because people are trading with each other voluntarily, and you are constantly increasing the pie, with the result that even the poorest over a period of time do better. And this is, this is not a historically disputable fact. I mean, countries that have free markets have done much better by the lower rung of society than countries that don't have the free market.
But I think,
as far as protecting the losers, can I just make one more point? As far as protecting the losers, Matt's point that there should be protection for losers, that actually has been tried, and it was tried with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, where the government essentially bailed out or gave a guarantee against bad subprime loans, and look at what we got.
Science is in crisis. More than half of all psychology studies cannot be replicated and find the same results. And we see increasing evidence in other sciences as well. More studies are retracted. They show bias, even fabrication. But that's dead wrong. Yes, we see many more studies that have to be retracted by scientific journals. But you know what? We also see many more studies than before, and many more scientific journals carrying retractions. And if you adjust for that, we haven't seen an increase in retractions. There's no increase in the proportion of studies that have to be retracted. The US Office of Research Integrity has not found an increase in misconduct. Yes, there is that landmark finding about psychological studies, that many of them cannot be replicated and find the same results. But there's something strange about that study. They didn't really replicate all those studies. They often used remarkably different methodologies. For example, a study that measured Americans' attitude toward African Americans was replicated with Italians. A study asking Israelis to imagine military service was replicated by asking Americans to imagine a honeymoon. When another team looked at nothing but replications that used the original method, the number of failures was what you would expect to observe by chance. So perhaps this is a failure of the replications, not of the originals. The poor eat crisps while the rich feast on crispy vegetables. There is nutritional inequality, and that's because the poor often live in food deserts, places far removed from supermarkets with healthy choices. Obesity, disease, and early death because of market failure. Oh no, that's dead wrong. If people only ate unhealthily because they didn't have any other options, they would change their habits if they moved to a richer place with more choice. Or when a supermarket enters a new area and introduces a wide selection of cheap, healthy food. But 3 researchers recently looked into both kinds of events in the United States, and they found that most people just kept eating whatever they ate before. When low-income households get the same food availability of the rich, it only reduced nutritional inequality by 9%. 91% remained unexplained. So, is it just too expensive to eat well? I don't think so. I prefer beer and a burger to whole grain and non-fat yogurt, but it's not because it's cheaper, because it isn't. In fact, when you exclude fresh produce that has traveled a long way, a healthy food basket costs 8% less than the unhealthy food basket. So, it's not you, it's me. It's not your supply, it's my demand.
Once you get into regulation, even if people think of Milton as sort of pro-business, but he recognized that business would be one of the first people to take advantage of regulation, and they would use regulation to exclude their competitors, to entrench their position in the business, and to do other things. And he was very aware of that was one of the things that would happen. So he sort of saw regulation as it would end up being, as opposed to what you might perceive you could do. And he had a very much, be careful what you wish for, because it's going to bring a lot of other things with it.
I'm not sure he could have foreseen what's happening here.
Of the wave of deregulations, we had telecommunications, we had trucking, we had air travel, we had energy, we had finance. I say we'd do 4 out of 5 have been good things.
Did you see the Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country? It's a shocking but true story of a spiritual community from India, which settles in the desert of Oregon in 1981, and they seize control of a neighboring town. They take control of local elections. They arm themselves and they poison people. It's proof that the US government must immediately shut such weirdos down. But that is dead wrong. In fact, when you look at this amazing documentary, you notice another pattern, that most of the awful things these sannyasins do were responses to government attempts to shut them down. Oregonians hated the group from the start and used land and environmental regulations to block their further expansion and denied them business permits. So their only chance of expanding further was to buy property in the neighboring town. This was the takeover that was so resented. So the group now faced more threats, and one of their hotels was bombed. Only then did they arm themselves in self-defense. This resulted in more attempts to shut the group down and deport their guru. The sannyasins tried to take over the local elections to stop this from happening. This is why they wanted to poison people with salmonella, to stop them from voting in the election. Crazy and evil. But it was attempts to destroy them that radicalized the group and gave more power to the most extreme people within this group. Proof that we should perhaps just leave people alone, even if we think they look weird. Donald Trump got his narcissist winning-at-any-cost philosophy from reading Ayn Rand's books. I heard that from former Labour Secretary Robert Reich. He said Trump's brand is Ayn Rand. But he is dead wrong. If you think that Trump is a Randian, you'd better check your premises. If Trump's brand stands for anything but whims and inconsistency, it's hostility to free trade and migration. And incidentally, Ayn Rand was in favor of total free trade and objected to immigration restrictions, and famously described racism as the lowest, most crudely primitive form of collectivism. But didn't Ayn Rand love rich businessmen? Oh yes, she did. If they made money, not if they stole it. In fact, she saved her fiercest ridicule for the evil rich, the pull peddlers, the deal makers who got rich from plundering taxpayers and consumers by eminent domain, tariffs and government subsidies. People like the crony capitalist Jim Taggart in her novel Atlas Shrugged. A narcissist who is obsessed with what others think of him. A manipulator without impulse control. More interested in pleasing the government than his customers. More interested in beating others than with his own achievements. Does that remind you of someone?
Let's try to create some backdoor way to force people to get rid of things that they might otherwise want. I think there is a little bit of tension because it's somewhat against the style of free to choose. It's like, well, the people are free to choose. They're choosing they want social insurance programs. They're willing to pay payroll taxes to get them. I think it's a little bit strange to go in and say, well, you don't know what you want. You're mistaken. Let's put in a rule that forbids you from being able to choose.
If Friedman were here, I think he would say, let the people want the programs, pay the taxes and get the benefits, and those of us who don't support the programs not pay the taxes and not get the benefits. And that's real free to choose.
Well, why bother going through taxes then? Just let the marketplace. And yet the marketplace shows millions, whether you believe 20 million or 40 million, don't have health care right now. If you want, that's not stable for the entire system, for those of us who do have health care.
For the immediate short-term, appeasement's very effective. You just kick the can down the road and it gets, unfortunately, more serious each time you do that. Hitler had less material resources in the mid-1930s than the combined democracies on the European continent. But he felt that because they were so willing to appease him, there must be some reason why that was. And so he kind of concluded that the winners of World War I were more traumatized than the losers. And that gave him more encouragement to try something even grander and bolder each year.
Within a year, the Nazis occupied the whole of Czechoslovakia.
The British people celebrated in the streets because it meant that there wasn't going to be a war. At least they didn't think there was going to be a war. And Winston Churchill actually said the exact opposite, said that this was a disaster, it was dishonourable, we were going to get war anyway, and he said it in the most beautiful, eloquent Churchillian phrases, and we actually have them here at the archives now. So this is going to be the 1938 Munich speech that Winston Churchill gave in the House of Commons. And here it is. Some wonderful stuff. Here he says, "I therefore begin by saying what is most unpopular and most unwelcome, what every one of us would like to ignore or forget, but what must nevertheless be stated, namely that we have sustained a total, unmitigated defeat." He also says, "There was never any danger of a fight if all the time one side meant to give away completely." That's one of the great obvious truths of appeasement.
I think that what we need to do, we need to pay more attention to the rules of the game. That is, what creates some of the inequality that we see. That is, for example, in New York City, the price to get a license to own and operate one taxi is $603,000. In Chicago, I believe it's something like close to $200,000, and many, many restrictions for people at the bottom of the economic ladder to get their feet on the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. Those are the kind of things that we should look at. What are the rules of the game, and how can we change the rules of the game to produce?
Control that too?
No, it doesn't. It's government. It's government. That is people who are on the inside.
Over 30 years, North Korea has found a formula of feigned madness and threat to develop nuclear weapons or the possession of nuclear weapons. And when you weld those two factors together, or you combine them, it has a formula to get massive foreign aid and to develop a global voice influence that's not commiserate with its small population and dismal economy. And they're not going to give that up. They're going to increase that method of operation. So they're going to get more nukes, and they're going to talk more as if they were unhinged.
Would the unpredictable, now nuclear-armed North Korean government concede to a show of force and curtail its aggressive behavior, as was the effect of Operation Paul Bunyan? Or would a show of force invite escalating violence?
All attempts to stop the North Koreans from acquiring nuclear technology
have failed. The key reason that this is dangerous is not that North Korea is going to attack the United States unprovoked. It's the danger of a rogue regime with the ultimate weapon that can essentially defy its neighbors and become increasingly a source of instability in the region. And the nightmare from my vantage point is a world in which the non-proliferation regime, which began in the late 1960s, completely falls apart. These things are steadily getting cheaper and easier. A world in which every 2-bit dictator has a nuke is a very dangerous world. Even if it's only by accident, the probability of a nuclear war goes up very appreciably. And we should really be thinking of the North Korean problem not just in terms of Kim Jong-un's ability to hit California with a nuke. It's all about his ability to cause non-proliferation, to break down as a regime. If the Far East or the Middle East become completely nuclearized, then the probability that we see an actual nuclear war in our lifetimes gets to be very high.
To get further economic expansion, you need people to have ideas. And ideas often require a freer spirit. That means political change. And you can see that happening in China, especially with the new technology that we have. Twitter, Facebook, or their versions of it. There's a lot more discussion. And I'm hopeful that over time, you will see the democratic expansion across the world.
So does either one of you believe that you can have a successful capital economy and an authoritarian rule?
You know, it's not, I think there are two links. You can think about running from success to democracy and from democracy to success. The consensus of the work in the academic literature, and I think the consensus among economists, is there's a strong link from success to democracy. That, and this is what Danny was talking about, people get wealthier. One of the things you want when you're wealthier is you want a voice.
Most of government spending is going through the big social insurance programs. And I think the kind of mixing of saving the Great Depression with things like Social Security are mixing up apples and oranges. I think that if you ask, when a Hurricane Katrina hits, when something like this semi-depression recession hits, do you truly not want the government to do anything? I think that's sort of an extreme case that few people would agree with. If you say, should we create massive structures that last for 50, 100 years beyond when the crises are over, I think a lot of people would probably agree, no, we don't want to do that.
But I think it's quite natural to say that, well, if some children are born blind, that we give them some extra assistance because there's an unusual difficulty there, that we need to give health care to the people who are in need of the health care rather than just hand it out equally or hand it out to the people who have the least.
But he was also suggesting
very important distinction between what you just said and the conception of equality, which is what you're talking about, and Milton Friedman actually conceded that when you have people who are in distress, then you do have a responsibility to do something about them. That's all right. What is not all right is income redistribution for its own sake, because we just don't like inequality.
Well, where's that money going to come from? Where is it going to come from? Well, is it a tooth fairy or Santa Claus?
Should the government be involved in telling us what to eat? Given the track record that they have so far, you could really make a pretty plausible argument that they've done more harm than good.
Milk is about the most perfect food there is. A glassful at every meal is good for you.
Once upon a time, meat, butter, eggs, and cheese were considered the foundation of a healthy diet.
Meat and eggs help the body grow and make it strong. Meat is good for you.
Then in the 1950s, a Minnesota doctor named Ansel Keys put forth his diet heart hypothesis, claiming that saturated fats raise cholesterol levels and cause heart attacks. He produced landmark studies backing up his findings, which transformed nutrition science, and Keyes became a powerful figure in the science community. Contemporaries who publicly questioned the validity of his findings risked losing their research funding. When the U.S. adopted dietary guidelines in 1980, Keyes' recommendations became enshrined in national food policy. Ever since, Americans have been getting fatter and more unhealthy, and despite major advances in treatment, heart disease is still the leading cause of death for both men and women. Today, the science behind Keyes' dietary findings is once again being challenged. Nina Teicholz is an investigative journalist and author of the New York Times bestseller, The Big Fat Surprise. Her book tells the story of how Keyes' research became conventional wisdom in the first place.
It did start in the 1950s when America was in a panic over the rising tide of heart disease, and there were a number of ideas about what caused heart disease, and into that sort of vacuum of explanation came Ansel Keys, a pathologist at the University of Minnesota. Many people know his story now. And it was the diet heart hypothesis that said it was not only saturated fat, but dietary cholesterol, right? Egg yolks, shellfish.
All the good stuff.
All the good stuff.
Cheese, meat.
That caused heart disease. And so how did that become enshrined in our institutions? It started with Ansel Keys getting himself onto the nutrition panel at the American Heart Association in 1961. The American Heart Association is the first institution anywhere in the world to say, don't eat saturated fats and dietary cholesterol to avoid a heart attack. That was like the tiny little germ that grew up into all the recommendations that we have today. It went from the American Heart Association. It was also at that time adopted by the National Institutes of Health. And then it evolved over to capture really the U.S. government completely in 1980 with the launch of our U.S. dietary guidelines, which was really just a wholesale adoption of what the American Heart Association had been saying. And by 1980, it wasn't just saturated fat. It had evolved to be all fat, right? So it was the low-fat diet as we know it. Keep saturated fat low, keep all fat low, and don't eat cholesterol.
Personally, I feel for me, it's almost somewhat confusing because one day, we see a study that says, meat and eggs are bad for you. The next day, eggs are okay. You can have it. We were wrong. I mean, why is the science all over the place with this?
There's like small flip-flopping headlines like caffeine's good, caffeine's bad, oat bran good, oat bran's bad. I'm dating myself with the oat bran there, but the bigger themes are really dietary cholesterol was one of the major culprits from that 1961 date on, and then was finally dropped in 2013 by the American Heart Association, 2015 by our dietary guidelines. So that's one big part of Ansel Keys' hypothesis that fell. And the other part of his hypothesis, which is saturated fat, that is wobbling now, right? But the explanation about why we have these flip-flopping headlines is mainly that it's this, we have made our policy based upon this weak kind of science called epidemiology, which shows association but not causation. And so we've taken this kind of weak science and made it the basis of our policy. And then when there's a more rigorous kind of science that comes along called randomized controlled clinical trials and kind of disproves that or cannot confirm that hypothesis, well, too bad, it's already policy. So we've had the situation where we just cannot reverse out of these policies that were originally based on really weak science.
Yeah, which is sad because, we've seen this emerging data that shows since the dietary guidelines have gone into effect, Americans have just been getting fatter. I think there was a New York Times article that said most Americans I think 40% are now classified as obese.
Yeah.
What have been some of the unintended consequences of basing policy on this kind of shoddy science?
Well, we're all fat and sick. It's sort of interesting to hear nutrition experts talk about sort of the slow, steady progress of nutrition science when you say, well, look at the outcome measures. What are your outcome measures? Obesity, dramatically still rising. Type 2 diabetes.
And heart disease.
Heart disease still number 1 or number 2 killer. Cancer on the rise. Fatty liver disease, a rising epidemic. Obesity amongst children. Imagine if you had a baseball team that lost every game for 50 years. You would say, hey, maybe there's something about the underlying assumptions of how we're training this team that is wrong. So, the experts in charge cannot really look at these outcomes and say, this is a success. And nutrition science is moving forward slowly. It's not moving forward. It's clearly like has no outcome that you can point to that seems successful at all.
Why is it so hard to change this? Because it seems like any alternative viewpoint is just viewed as heresy and ignored.
There's so many reasons. There's intellectual conflicts of interest of academics who've invested their entire careers in trying to show one idea is right. It's not easy to change that. There's tremendous cognitive dissonance. You have public health institutions invested in a certain set of dietary guidelines that they can't be flip-flopping on their publics. They can't admit wrong. I mean, you know, you look at the way that American Heart Association and the U.S. Dietary Guidelines sort of like tiptoed away from the low-fat diet. They don't actually recommend a low-fat diet anymore. If you go to their websites, you can't find it. And why do they tiptoe away from it? Well, that kind of reversal and embarrassment is something that institutions who are supported by the public trust, they can't afford to lose.
You actually go through and list all the clinical trials about the low-fat diet. And actually, what I thought was interesting, the U.S. government actually spent somewhere in the neighborhood of like $1 billion to test this hypothesis and found that it wasn't effective, yet I've never really seen or heard any of those studies. You know, can you talk a little bit about the suppression of information and what does that say about government being involved in food policy at all?
Yeah, well, so the government did spend, National Institutes of Health spent over $1 billion funding randomized controlled clinical trials, the most rigorous kind of science you can do, testing Ansel Keys' hypothesis, right? Because they understood this hypothesis had been adopted as policy, but maybe it wasn't supported. Maybe it was only, they needed more rigorous science for it. Those trials on more than 65,000 people failed to confirm his hypothesis. They could not show that eating saturated fat and dietary cholesterol had any effect on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. What happened to that science never became part of the scientific record, not included in scientific review papers, not spoken about, and most critically, was never used to formulate any of our nutrition policy, which is to say, the experts who put together the dietary guidelines never reviewed those clinical trials, ever. When I wrote about that fact for a story for the British Medical Journal, 180 scientists, including the entire Dietary Guideline Committee from 2015, all called for the retraction of that paper. Because that's explosive.
But why? Yeah, I guess I would just ask, why are they so threatened by that? Because that seems like information that people should have had and that we need to know.
It shows that, the expert community and all of our our trusted public health institutions have ignored science, and they have been wrong about, they basically ignored science and continued recommendations based on, weak data that has made Americans fat and sick. So, who would want to own that legacy? I surely would not.
So we know that saturated fats aren't bad for your health, but what about things like LDL cholesterol that so many doctors focus on as being the culprit in heart disease?
Yeah. So it's a little bit of a complex story. Saturated fats do raise your total cholesterol and your LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol is the bad kind that your doctor focuses on. But it turns out that changing your LDL cholesterol while it may work with statins and drugs, the diet experiments show that changing your LDL cholesterol with diet has no effect on your cardiovascular outcomes. So it just is true that is not a factor when it comes to diet. LDL cholesterol is why saturated fats are still in jail today, right? Mm-hmm. And they focus on, I should say, this is like short-term intermediate data rather than looking at the mortality, the long-term mortality data, which clearly shows, regardless of what's happening with your LDL cholesterol here, your mortality, you have same rate of mortality. It's not causing increased rates of mortality. That's the outcome you want to focus on, right? But the thing about saturated fats is also they raise your good cholesterol, your HDL. They're the most efficient way to raise your good cholesterol, which turns out to be a much better predictor of your long-term cardiovascular risk. So, the reason your doctor focuses on LDL, a cynic might say, is that they have drugs to prescribe for LDL. Industry tried to create drugs for your HDL, and they could never successfully do that. They could not figure out how to raise your HDL through drugs. So The cynic in me says that your doctor's prescribing is focusing on LDL because that's what they have a drug to prescribe. And saturated fats kind of get caught up in that whole model, that LDL model. But it just turns out that through diet, the diet's effect on LDL is not significant for your cardiovascular outcomes.
We look at policy, but beyond that, we've seen government efforts to ban trans fats. The new thing now is to push these laws taxing soda. Do you think that influences health at all?
I think that government made a big mistake with the dietary guidelines. It told all Americans to eat a high-grain diet. This is what most plausibly what made America fat and diabetic. That's the big mistake. These smaller efforts around the margins, soda bans, soda taxes, really, they might do a little something, but the major mistake is at the foundation of our dietary guidelines, that big bottom slab of the food pyramid. That was the major mistake. And until that changes, I think these other efforts are just mainly cosmetic.
When I heard you on the Joe Rogan podcast, I think you talked about how, you don't really peg yourself as a libertarian, but as you kind of started doing this work, kind of pushed you in that direction. Can you talk about that and why?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Berkeley, California, and I come from, we're all Democrats, and I've always believed, partly because I live so far from government, that it could only do good and help people in the world. And I believe there is a role for government in doing those things. But here is like the one place that I investigated deeply a government program that seems to have been just a complete disaster for the country. And, if I turn over this leaf and this is what I find, what would happen if you turned over another leaf and see what else you find? So, I think, I've become more distrustful of government programs like this. You see in Washington, who's in Washington, lobbying government? It's all the corporations. There's no place for, citizens are not there, or they're not represented as well, or they're not as organized, or they're not as well funded. So, who wins out in influencing government is corporate America.
Do you see a demand side type solution to this where people are just going to try different things and experiment with their own diet, find out what works for them, independent of what government tells them what to do?
So that is what we see happening, right? You see, and everybody, it's unlike, say, environmental policy where, in diet and nutrition, everybody can do their own N=1 experiment, right? You can go on a different diet, see if it works for you. And then you have your own data, your own observations. You can't do that in other forms of policy, right? So everybody has the ability to sort of find their own truth, right? But the reason that I don't think that will be a complete solution is that this top-down nature of the control that the dietary guidelines exert over America is so much more extreme than I had realized when I even just a couple of years ago when I started looking into this. They control all the feeding assistance programs that come out of the USDA, school lunches, feeding programs for the elderly. They control military rations. They control, what every doctor, dietitian, nutritionist, nurse on the front lines, all healthcare practitioners just kind of download the guidelines and deliver them to people. K through 12 nutrition education. They control the food supply through what can be called healthy on a food package. All cattle has been bred to be lean. All milk is lean, low-fat products. All of that comes from the guidelines.
Since these guidelines are so important, can you talk about your work with the Nutrition Coalition and what your mission is there?
So this group, a nonprofit group that I started in Washington, D.C., it's an educational group. We accept no industry funding of any kind or any interested industry. Our goal is to educate people about how the dietary guidelines have not been successful, why they've not been successful, and to bring this alternative viewpoint to policymakers and public health experts. It was shocking to me when I started going to Washington, nobody had ever heard of any of these ideas. There's the really dominant view is that the dietary guidelines are good, they're the gold standard, they're based on good science, and the reason that America is fat and sick is that America has failed to follow them.
Which we know is not true.
Right, well, that's when I started looking at the data. Is it true we failed to follow them? By every food category you can find, we have faithfully, dutifully follow the guidelines. Meat is down, animal fats are down, butter is down, eggs are down. We consume more fruits, more vegetables, more grains, more vegetable oils. I mean, all of that since 1980 is up. In every category you can find. And also in terms of macronutrients, right? 30% increase in carbohydrates since 1965. And we've dropped our consumption of fat, and our saturated fat has gone down since the guidelines by 17 or 18%. So we've really done a good job of following the guidelines. And the story you can tell about us not following the guidelines is that they keep increasing the quotas, like eat more fruits, eat more vegetables. It's like Americans are going in this direction, but we just can't quite get there. But it hasn't worked so far.
So we see that the USDA is starting the process for the 2020 dietary guidelines, and they've actually opened up for public comment. Can you talk about the significance of that?
The USDA is, for the first time ever, they decided to start the process for the dietary guidelines by, instead of reviewing all the science, they said, we're going to select some fields, and I guess this is sort of wishful thinking on my part, but we're going to select some topics on which we think the science, our guidelines may not reflect the latest and best science. And incredibly, in that relatively short list is included the low carbohydrate diet and saturated fats, which are certainly areas where the guidelines do not reflect the science. So they opened this up for public comment, and that was also unique and I think uniquely transparent move. I think that my sense is that the USDA actually wants to see policy change, but they want to do it in a way that is transparent and good science.
So is there actually any hope for food policy change?
I think so, actually. I think there is. I think that the universe of scientists, doctors, and experts who are willing to step up now and talk about the changing understanding of the science has really shifted over the last few years. You see an increasingly vocal, more and more experts are willing to talk out about the science. And so I think that will support change. I really do.